here and there, and you've got these these gorgeous seasonal things, and then all the ecological functions are still being served. So, and these are the ones particularly for wet environments, plantings around the pond and plantings in some of the wetter forest garden spots. And then on dry environments, this is a little harder to find good pollinators, but a couple I have in mind here. The gray stem dogwood, which actually has very reddish stems sometimes, but it's a very different kind of plant. It grows in dry. There's places where it'll colonize a whole hillside. That's especially one that hasn't been grazed very frequently. It can replace pastures sometimes, but with frequent grazing that won't happen. But this is another one that the native pollinators really like. And then this is the Illinois bundle flower, which I'm always interested in looking for native nitrogen fixers, because in the tropics with these agroforestry systems, 40 to 50% of the planting area is usually nitrogen fixing trees, because of the nutrient cycling they have to do. And now our needs aren't as heavy duty in the cold climates because we have more fertility stored in the soil, but it's still very useful to have nitrogen in your system. And because black locust is banned in the state of Massachusetts, we can't use it. It would be the #1 choice if it were legally available, because it's one of the most useful trees for agroforestry in the world. But in the absence of black locust, we're looking at things like some of these herbaceous nitrogen fixers like the bundle flower and the wild senna, and some of these. So in addition to the senna, this is lead plant, which is another native nitrogen fixer from the prairies that makes beautiful purple flowers, and the bees really love as well. It's actually a woody shrub. It's a small woody shrub. This is bristly locust. So it's a shrub locust that has edible flowers like the black locust does, but it's about 8 to 10 feet tall at most, and it has spiny stems.
Is it robinia?
It is robinia. And this is the buffalo berry. So this is the North American autumn. So the autumn olive was used for beautifying highway median strips, and then escaped, and people have strong feelings about it. And however, there are members of that. What is it called? It's the Elaeagnus. There's members of the Elaeagnaceae around the world, and the one from North America is this buffalo berry from the prairies, which is another edible fruit-producing nitrogen-fixing shrub. So really, really useful for diversified systems. Just want to speak for a moment about forest management. The process here too is in the places that are not developed into silvopastures, what is the land use regime? What is the really appropriate way to work with the forest, knowing that it has a history of cutting and clearing, and also it has an older history that involves and people and animals and species that are gone, like the American chestnut and the passenger pigeon. So what do we do now with forests? It's a big question that a lot of people are facing. And so two of the directions that we're often trying to go in with forest management, we're thinking about kind of restorative forestry, because most forestry in New England in the last 100 years has been euphemistically termed selective cutting or thinning, but a more accurate term would be high grading, which is take the best trees and run. And when you do that, you are selecting for the trees that are less genetically suited to the site where they're growing. And so you're doing a long-term degrading of both the timber value and the ecological fitness of the trees on that site. It's understandable why people have done that. It's very unideal, and we should figure out alternatives wherever possible. So one of these alternatives is to manage towards more old growth conditions, and involves different forms of uneven age management where you're having multiple size classes all present in the forest at the same time. And there's a whole amazing science of how people have been working on that. Including some very interesting recent stuff where they're trying to directly mimic the way that small wind disturbances work in the forest. So they're basically trying to cut from the forest the way a microburst would hit. And so that there's the maximum diversity of remaining trees, and the shapes of the removal are suitable for the regeneration of a diversity of species. It's very, very interesting. And then this one is recognizing the role of these early succession tree environments, where these small patches that then regrow. This is where some of the new species come in and some of the old species are returned to the landscape. And it's also where you have a lot of habitat for forest herbivores and different forest nesting birds that need gap environments, and a lot of diversity happens in these gaps. So old growth forests included a lot of gaps. You know, there wasn't just trees from sea to shining sea. It was a lot of patchiness. And so, you know, there's a couple different forest management regimes we're recommending as part of this process. This is a stand of primarily oaks on the property here, just to the north of the open hilltop. And those oaks are some of them are really nice specimens, beautiful maturing red oak. And also there's a fair amount of erosion on some parts of this hillside. And there's also an interesting presence of highbush blueberry. So the recommendation here is to create more of these, you know, foraging walks where with a little bit of brush swaling, where you stake bolts of brush into the ground to leaves over time. And then you can add some more of those highbush blueberries in there, and you have a little contour walkway of foraging in the park shade. And then we would do a little bit of thinning, but not of the largest trees, but to release the largest and best formed trees. So essentially a thinning from below rather than a thinning from above. And then here in this stand, this is one of the most remote forest stands on the property, and also one of the most diverse. There's 3 different species of conifers here. Actually, I think there's 4. There's white pines, 1 or 2 hemlocks, and there's red pine and pitch pines. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on here, and there's the juniper in some places. So this is a place to, if there was timber management was a desired future here for projects around the farm, building materials, you know, making materials that came right from the land. This would be a place to do that, and I think the way to do it here would be to employ some of these managing towards old growth techniques where we're trying to increase the structural complexity of the forest by taking small patches of trees in a way that you have 3 or 4 or 5 different ages of trees all next to each other. So then the young trees are already there to replace the older ones as they develop, and in that system, and a lot of woody debris on the ground. A lot of material to decompose and add forest carbon and add amphibian habitat. And then one of the side projects that can happen out of all this is the production of mushrooms. Mushrooms are really interesting from logs because the mushrooms don't care what shape the tree was growing in. All they care about is the wood. So if you have non-rotting, poorly formed trees in the understory that you want to thin out to improve the future forest, you can grow a lot of mushrooms. It's a really great use of that material, and then most of the carbon is still in the log once the mushrooms finish producing, and you can just return it back to the earth and it can go back into the soil carbon pool. So this is a really great process and something that I and a lot of my friends and colleagues work with in New York. And we've identified a place for mushroom farming on the property, which is just northwest of the pond. It's a place that's flat, shaded, and close by, which are really the 3 criteria, because you have to check on the mushrooms almost every day during their big flushing periods during the year. And you have water tanks with them. So you manage the level of moisture that they're experiencing, and you induce them to flush in a cycle. You have a schedule basically of flushing when, so that you can monitor your level of production over the course of the year. But this is a great practice. It's been profitable as a small scale complementary enterprise for a lot of growers, and the logs produce for 3 or 4 years after they're inoculated. So it's a perennial use of a resource once you cut the trees down. So the process, Archie can speak a little more to that, but the process we've gone through an iterative process where there's been several rounds of and design proposals and feedback about those proposals. So based on 2 or 3 rounds of input from the management team so far. And then the phasing of projects like this is also an interesting question. And it's been identified that some of the biggest priorities here are the establishment of those silvopastures as a area of new grazing acreage for the goats and sheep, the establishment of the infiltration basins, nutrient banks to reduce the nutrient runoff into the pond, and then the development of some of these new orchard systems, and some of the longer term, multi-strata forest gardens or chestnut orchard production, those might be a little bit further off in the future.
Is this a 5-year plan, a 10-year plan, a 50-year plan?
So what I've shown in this map, this would, in terms of how fast these trees grow to their mature size, this could look like this in 10 years or less. And you could put it all on the ground next year if you had the people and time and resources to do that, and money, yeah, for sure. So the other thing that's going along with this is detailed implementation budgets, so that the managers of the farm can make well-informed decisions about what to invest in and what sequence. Yeah, so as I said at the beginning, we were specifically not chartered with redesigning the crop production on the farm, because there's a whole team that already thinks about that and does that. And really we were looking at how can agroforestry and the use of trees in the landscape complement and diversify and add to that existing farm production. So there is a lot of interesting talked about diversifying and intensifying annual crops, and I'd be happy to with those who are interested, and it wasn't the focus of this particular body of work. Carbon sequestration in agricultural practices is a big focus of mine. It is basically, I believe, on small farms, the primary focus has to be what makes the farm work. So it has to be about the co-benefits of carbon farming as well as the carbon storage itself. It's on a policy level that the carbon sequestration has to be incentivized. And we're working on that politically in New York State right now with a carbon farming tax credit bill that I've been advising and hopefully will become law one day and be able to provide payments for farmers for their carbon storage. What I would say about that research in New Mexico, and there's others at Texas A&M, and there's a number of places where people are getting higher numbers on soil carbon sequestration, and those are very promising and interesting. However, in the social process of science, you need an accumulation of data from many different sites over a period of time in order to confidently say that this is likely to work on any given site. The dynamics in the humid temperate climates are so different in terms of all aspects of the ecosystem than in the high desert in New Mexico, that the same practice applied there taken to here is not likely to have the same result for the same reasons. And so although there have been some of those high-end or even potentially outlier results that are really promising and point towards future research, the accumulation of data does not point to that yet. And so that's why the research in that book has been on the conservative side, and that's why the numbers that the IPCC are basing its estimates on are also on the conservative side. So let's do more research, and hopefully that is indeed possible. And then in terms of your question about traction, what I'm seeing is that the biggest obstacle to people doing major carbon sequestration projects on agricultural land is land tenure and land security, because these are long-term land improvements. They're basically capital expenditures. And so you can't make a capital expenditure if you don't know you're going to be there in 7 or 10 or 15 years. And so the land reform process has to go really hand in hand with the carbon sequestration work, in my opinion, from everything I've seen so far. There's a tool that was built by folks out of the Marin Carbon Project in California, as well as some outfits in Colorado, called COMET, which was funded by USDA Farm Bill a few years back. And COMET is a agricultural emissions estimator and agricultural sequestration estimator. So it's carbon in and carbon and methane out and carbon in. And you can't expect smallholder farmers to pay themselves for the transition to practices that are in the public good. So there has to be support from private sector, NGO, and public sector for them to do that. Sure. Yeah. So again, there's been several stages of feedback that have come into the design map so far. And then what's coming next is a of reports that are support documentation for the design. So those include plant lists and nursery sourcing and budgets for the implementation strategies, and then a detailed narrative description of each of the elements. Okay, well, thank you, friends, for coming. Really appreciate your time and attention. Thanks for staying late with me. More to come.